The atelier buzzed with nervous energy as Adrian Chen stood before his latest creation, pins delicately balanced between his lips. His fingers, calloused from years of hand stitching, traced the intricate beadwork adorning the bodice of a gown that had consumed his nights for weeks. The Manhattan sunrise painted the white walls in hues of amber, catching the sequins and making them dance like stars fallen to earth. "It's still not perfect," he murmured, adjusting a fold of silk with surgical precision. The dress form before him held what others might consider a masterpiece, but Adrian saw only the microscopic flaws that kept him awake at night. Behind him, Marcus, his assistant of 3 years, sighed dramatically. "Adrian, darling, if you make one more adjustment, I'm calling security. The show is in 6 hours, and you haven't slept in what, 3 days?" Adrian smiled faintly, still focused on the dress. "Sleep is for those who have made it, Marcus. We're still climbing." The truth hung heavy in the air between them. At 32, Adrian had accomplished what many considered impossible, building a respected atelier in the heart of New York's fashion district. But respect didn't equal acceptance, and the whispers that followed him through industry events cut deeper than any needle. His phone buzzed, and Adrian's stomach tightened as he saw the notification. Victoria Blackwood's latest piece for Style and Substance magazine had dropped. His fingers hesitated over the screen before Marcus snatched the phone away. "Oh no, not today. You don't need her poison in your head before the show." But Adrian had already glimpsed the headline. "The masculine mistake. Why men don't belong in women's fashion." His hands trembled slightly as he returned to the dress, but his voice remained steady. "Read it to me, Marcus. I need to know what we're up against." Marcus hesitated, then began reading with growing indignation. In an industry built on understanding the female form and experience, the rising trend of male designers, particularly those who have never lived in women's shoes, raises serious questions about authenticity and perspective. She actually went there. Adrian's jaw tightened as he listened to Victoria's eloquent dismantling of male designers in women's fashion, her particular focus on him barely veiled behind careful words. Her critique wasn't just about his designs, it was about his very right to create them. While Chen's technical skills are undeniable, Marcus continued reading. His latest collection reflects the fundamental disconnect between male designers and female reality. His evening wear, though expertly crafted, fails to consider the practical needs of modern women, instead creating costumes that prioritize male fantasy over female functionality. Adrian stepped back from the dress, memories flooding his mind. He was 8 again, sketching dresses in the margins of his math homework, while his father tried to interest him in football. 15, when his mother found his collection of fashion magazines hidden under his bed like contraband. 21, when he came out to his parents the same night he told them he was rejecting his business school acceptance to study fashion design. "She's wrong," Adrian said softly, more to himself than Marcus. "Fashion isn't about gender. It's about vision, about creating something that makes people feel extraordinary." The atelier door opened, and Sophia, his head seamstress, entered with a garment bag. Her face was grim. "Adrian, darling, have you seen the guest list for tonight?" He shook his head, already dreading the answer. "Victoria Blackwood confirmed this morning. Front row." The room fell silent. Victoria's presence at his show wasn't just about reviewing his collection, it was a challenge. She would be there, watching, ready to tear apart not just his designs, but everything he represented. Adrian turned back to the dress, his fingers finding a loose sequin. "Then we'll give her something worth writing about." His voice gained strength as he spoke. "Call the team in early. If Victoria wants to question whether men belong in fashion, let's show her exactly what we can do." As his team assembled, Adrian felt the familiar fire building in his chest. He'd faced doubt before, from his family, from society, from an industry that often seemed determined to keep him in his place. But doubt had never stopped him. If anything, it fueled him. The next few hours were a blur of final adjustments and preparations. Adrian moved through his collection, each piece a statement, each detail a declaration. These weren't just dresses, they were armor for the modern woman, designed with an understanding that came not from living as a woman, but from a lifetime of watching, listening, and creating. As the sun climbed higher over Manhattan, Adrian finally allowed himself to step away from his work. The collection was ready. In a few hours, 42 pieces would tell his story on the runway. But more than that, they would challenge every preconception Victoria Blackwood and her followers held about who had the right to create beauty. Marcus appeared at his side with a fresh espresso. "You know what they're saying in the blogs? That you're finished before you've begun." That no serious buyer will touch a collection with this much controversy. Adrian took the coffee, inhaling the rich aroma. They said the same thing when I opened this atelier. When I showed my first collection. When I refused to compromise my vision to fit their expectations. He smiled, a quiet confidence replacing the earlier tension. Let them talk, Marcus. Tonight, my work will speak louder. As his team dispersed to begin their final preparations, Adrian stood alone in his atelier. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across his collection. Each piece held a piece of his soul, a testament to countless nights spent perfecting seams and reimagining silhouettes. Victoria Blackwood might question his right to be here, but these creations, these works of art, they belonged exactly where they were. His phone buzzed again, another notification about Victoria's article. This time, Adrian didn't flinch. Let her write her critiques. Let her sit in judgment. Tonight, he would remind the fashion world that creativity knows no gender, that passion transcends prejudice, and that sometimes the most beautiful designs come from the most unexpected sources. He touched the dress one final time, a silent promise to himself and to every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Tonight, he would prove them all wrong. Not with words, not with arguments, but with the pure, undeniable power of creation. The revolution would begin on the runway, one stitch at a time. The backstage area of the Thompson Center hummed with controlled chaos as Adrian adjusted the final details on his first model. The clock ticked relentlessly towards showtime, each second carrying the weight of a decade's worth of struggle and resistance. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind wandered through the maze of memories that had led him here. 5 minutes until preliminary lighting check, called out Sarah, his production manager. Her clipboard was covered in meticulous notes, each detail a potential lifeline, a landmine in the carefully orchestrated performance to come. Adrian caught his reflection in the makeup mirror, dark circles under his eyes, telling the story of countless sleepless nights. Beyond his reflection, he could see Isabella Martinez, his mentor and one of the few established designers who had dared to support him publicly. Your shoulders are touching your ears again, Corito, Isabella said, approaching him with the quiet grace that had made her a legend in the industry. Remember what I told you when you were just my intern? Adrian's lips curved into a slight smile. Tension shows in the clothes. Exactly. She squeezed his shoulder, her presence a reminder of the day she'd found him crying in her studio's supply closet after his first major rejection. They called me a Spanish upstart who didn't understand American fashion. Now they call me a visionary. Labels change, talent doesn't. The memory of his first industry rejection flooded back the prestigious Fitzgerald Grant, denied not because of his designs, but because the committee had concerns about his perspective on women's wear. The rejection letter had been polite, wrapped in careful language that couldn't quite hide its prejudice. Marcus appeared with a garment bag, his face unusually serious. The buyers from Bergdorf's just arrived. And Diane Winters is with them. Adrian's hand stilled. Diane Winters, the retail queen who had publicly declared 6 months ago that she would never stock designs from creators who lacked the essential feminine insight. Her presence was both an opportunity and a threat. Let them watch, Isabella said firmly. Your work speaks louder than their prejudice. The words barely had time to land before Sarah rushed over, her face pale. Adrian, we have a problem. The zipper on look 27 just broke, and Victoria Blackwood's assistant was seen taking photos. Of course she was. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. Get me my emergency kit. We've got 3 hours, and that zipper isn't going to be our downfall.
As he worked to repair the damage, his mind drifted to the letter he'd received that morning from his father. After years of silence, his dad had written, "Your mother showed me your latest piece in Vogue. I may not understand your world, but I'm proud of you for fighting for your place in it." The letter was worn from multiple readings, carried in his pocket like a talisman. His father's words were a reminder that acceptance could come from the most unexpected places, even as rejection appeared in equally surprising corners. Adrian, Marcus's urgent voice cut through his thoughts. Page 6 just posted about the show. They're calling it the last stand of the male gaze in fashion. A bitter laugh escaped Adrian's lips. At least they're being creative with their criticism now. He finished the zipper repair with a flourish, the fix invisible to all but the most trained eye. The headlines had grown increasingly hostile over the past year. The masculine invasion of female spaces. Fashion's gender crisis. Each article more pointed than the last, each critique thinly veiling the fundamental question. What right did he have to design for women? His phone buzzed with a text from Elena, his sister and fiercest defender since childhood. Remember what Mom used to say, the loudest critics are usually the most afraid. Show them what real courage looks like. Elena had been there through it all, the nights he spent teaching himself to sew, the rejections from fashion schools that preferred female candidates for women's wear programs, the investors who backed out when they realized the HN they'd been corresponding with was male. 10 minutes to first rehearsal, Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the growing backstage tension. Adrian stood, surveying the controlled chaos around him. His team moved with purpose, each person a carefully chosen ally in this ongoing battle. There was Marcus, who turned down a prestigious position at Vogue to stay with him. Sarah, who'd fought her own battles as a trans woman in production management. The seamstresses, models, and assistants who believed in his vision enough to risk their reputations on a designer that the industry seemed determined to reject. "They're saying the collection is too ambitious," Marcus said quietly, showing Adrian yet another critical social media post, "that you're overreaching to prove a point." "Maybe I am." Adrian adjusted a hem with perfect precision. "But sometimes overreaching is the only way to grab what they're trying to keep out of your reach." Isabella appeared again, this time with a stern expression. "Enough with the phones, enough with the critics. Show me the finale piece." Adrian led her to the last dress, his pride in the creation warring with his fear of judgment. The dress was a revolution in silk and structure, challenging every convention while honoring the classical forms that had drawn him to fashion in the first place. Isabella circled it slowly, her experienced eye taking in every detail. Finally, she smiled. "This is why they're afraid, Corrido. Not because you're a man designing for women, but because you design with both strength and sensitivity. They can't put you in a box, so they try to keep you out of the room entirely." The weight of the moment settled over Adrian. In 3 hours, this collection would either vindicate or destroy him. The critics were waiting, the buyers were watching, and Victoria Blackwood was sharpening her pen for what she surely hoped would be his professional eulogy. "Adrian," Sarah called out, "Victoria's assistant is asking about seating changes. She wants to move to a better angle for photos." "Give her what she wants," Adrian replied, his voice steady. "Make sure she has the perfect view of every single piece." The bustling energy of the backstage area suddenly seemed to crystallize around him. This wasn't just about proving Victoria wrong or winning over hostile buyers. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every creative soul trapped by society's narrow definitions of who could create what. "Places for rehearsal," Sarah's voice rang out, and the models began lining up in their first looks. Adrian watched them move into position, each garment a piece of his heart made visible. He thought of all the barriers he'd faced, all the doors that had been closed, all the subtle and not so subtle messages that he should stick to menswear or leave fashion altogether. "Ready to shake their world?" Marcus asked, straightening Adrian's jacket. Adrian nodded, his expression resolute. "Ready to show them that fashion isn't about gender, it's about vision. And nobody gets to put limitations on vision." As the first beats of the rehearsal music began to pulse through the speakers, Adrian Chen stood tall, surrounded by his allies, his art, and his unwavering belief that talent and passion could overcome even the most deeply entrenched prejudices. The real show was still hours away, but the revolution had already begun. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with Fashion Week's elite as Adrian navigated through clusters of industry powerbrokers. The annual Designers Guild Awards were in full swing, but beneath the champagne bubbles and air kisses lurked an undercurrent of tension. His nomination for Designer of the Year had sparked a firestorm of controversy. "Darling, you came." Isabella's voice cut through the murmur. She kissed his cheek, then whispered, "Victoria's by the bar. She's been holding court for an hour, and your name keeps coming up." Adrian's jaw tightened, but his smile remained fixed. "Of course it does. Heaven forbid she talk about the actual craft of fashion." Across the room, Victoria Blackwood commanded attention in a perfectly tailored vintage Dior. Her voice carried just enough to ensure her targets could hear. "The nomination itself raises questions about the direction of our industry. Are we so desperate for novelty that we're willing to sacrifice authentic feminine perspective?" Marcus appeared at Adrian's side, champagne flute in hand. "Drink this. You'll need it. She's just getting started." When did fashion become about shock value rather than understanding? Victoria continued, her audience growing. "A man designing women's wear isn't revolutionary, it's regressive. It's another example of male voices drowning out female experiences." The champagne turned bitter in Adrian's mouth. Every criticism struck at his deepest insecurities, but he'd learned to wear them like armor. He straightened his spine, adjusting his own creation, a perfectly tailored jacket that blended masculine structure with feminine fluidity. Adrian Chen? A voice boomed across the room. Richard Wellington, the guild's president, approached with open arms. The man of the hour? Though some might say the controversial choice. The surrounding conversations hushed, attention shifting their way. Victoria's group turned, her perfectly arched eyebrow conveying volumes of disdain. Richard, Adrian acknowledged, keeping his voice level. Controversy seems to follow me these days. Oh, come now, Richard laughed too loudly. Surely you expected some pushback. It's unprecedented, you know. A male designer nominated for achievements in women's wear. Unprecedented? Isabella stepped forward, her accent thickening with anger. Balenciaga? Saint Laurent? Or do they not count because they fit your comfortable narrative of male genius? Victoria glided over, her smile sharp as a razor. The difference, dear Isabella, is that those men worked in different times. Today's fashion industry should reflect modern understanding of gender dynamics and lived experiences. Adrian felt the room's energy shift, the battle lines being drawn. He'd faced criticism before, but this was different. This was war, fought with words and weighted with years of industry politics. And what understanding would that be, Victoria? Adrian found himself asking, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. That creativity has a gender? That empathy is exclusive to chromosomes? Victoria's smile didn't waver. That authenticity matters. That perspective matters. That women deserve to have their stories told by voices that truly understand them. Like you understand them? The words escaped before Adrian could stop them. With your $500 haircut and your trust fund and your articles attacking any designer who doesn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable? The room collectively held its breath. Victoria's smile froze, then slowly transformed into something more predatory. At least I don't presume to know what women want simply because I can stitch a decent seam. No, you just presume to speak for all women while tearing down anyone who challenges your prejudices. Adrian stepped closer, years of contained frustration finally breaking free. You're not protecting women's voices, Victoria. You're using them as a shield for your own bigotry. The silence was deafening. Marcus gripped Adrian's arm in warning, but it was too late. Bigotry? Victoria laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Is that what you call maintaining standards? Protecting spaces? But then, you've made quite a career of forcing your way into spaces where you don't belong. The only space I've forced my way into is the space I've earned through talent, hard work, and yes, understanding. Adrian's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. Every piece I create comes from countless hours of listening to women, learning their needs, respecting their experiences. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? You're too busy writing headlines to actually observe the work. Victoria's face flushed. How dare you question my expertise? I question your agenda, Adrian cut in. Every article, every critique, it's never about the clothes. It's about me. My gender. My orientation. When was the last time you actually reviewed a collection based on its merits rather than its creator's identity? The room buzzed with whispers. Phone cameras discreetly captured the confrontation. Tomorrow's headlines were being written in real time. You want to talk about merits? Victoria's voice rose slightly. Let's talk about your last collection. The one with the evening gowns that prioritized drama over functionality. The suits that look like costumes for women playing at power rather than living it. Every piece screaming with male fantasy rather than female reality. Those pieces sold out in 3 days, Adrian countered. To real women, with real lives and real power. Women who chose my designs not because of my gender, but because they saw themselves in my vision. A vision tainted by privilege and presumption. No, Victoria. A vision born of respect and dedication. But you'd rather craft narratives about gender wars than acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, great design transcends your comfortable categories. Isabella stepped between them, her presence commanding attention. Enough. This is the Designers Guild Awards, not a schoolyard brawl. But Victoria wasn't finished. You want to talk about respect? You're a tourist in women's fashion, playing dress up with our identities, while the industry applauds your bravery. It's not brave to invade spaces. It's not revolutionary to appropriate experiences. Adrian felt something snap inside him, not in anger, but in clarity. You know what's not brave, Victoria? Hiding behind feminism to mask prejudice. Using your platform to bully rather than elevate. That's not protecting women's spaces, that's poisoning them. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria stepped back as if struck, her carefully crafted persona cracking slightly. The nomination stands, Richard announced awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension. The committee made its decision based on the work itself. The work, Adrian echoed, suddenly tired of the fight. That's all it's ever been about for me. Not gender, not politics, just the work. But some people can see past their own biases to recognize that talent doesn't conform to their expectations. He turned to leave, but Victoria's voice stopped him. This isn't over, Chen. Your nomination doesn't validate your presence here. Adrian looked back, meeting her gaze steadily. No, Victoria, it doesn't. My work does that. My clients do that. The women who choose to wear my designs do that. Your approval has never been necessary for my success. As he walked away, the whispers followed him. But for the first time, they didn't cut as deep. He'd finally said what needed to be said, consequences be damned. Marcus caught up with him at the door. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both, Adrian admitted. But I'm done letting her define my story. His phone was already buzzing with notifications, fashion blogs covering the confrontation, social media exploding with takes and tweets. But amid the chaos, one message stood out. A text from Elena. Mom always said the truth comes out when we stop being afraid to speak it. Proud of you, big brother. Adrian stepped into the cool night air, leaving behind the glitter and drama of the ballroom. Tomorrow would bring new headlines, new criticisms, new battles. But tonight, he'd finally found his voice, not as a male designer, not as an outsider, but as an artist who refused to let anyone else define his right to create. The war wasn't over, but something had shifted. In standing up to Victoria, he'd done more than defend himself, he challenged the very foundations of the industry's prejudices. And sometimes, that's where revolution begins. The midnight hours in Adrian's atelier pulsed with a different kind of energy. Gone was the daytime chaos of fittings and phone calls, replaced by the steady hum of sewing machines and the whisper of fabric against work tables. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Victoria, and Adrian had channeled every ounce of that energy into his newest collection. You're doing it again, Marcus said softly, placing a fresh espresso beside Adrian's workstation. That thing where you forget humans need sleep. Adrian barely looked up from the intricate beadwork before him, his fingers moving with hypnotic precision. Sleep is for people who aren't redefining an industry. The collection was unlike anything he'd attempted before. 40 pieces that challenged every convention, every stereotype about what women's fashion should be. Each garment told a story of transformation, of breaking free from expectations. The investors called again, Marcus continued, his voice careful. They're nervous about the direction. They say it's too bold, too confrontational. Adrian's hands stilled for a moment. The investors' concerns weren't unfounded. He poured every penny of his savings into this collection, mortgaged his apartment, even sold his car. One misstep, one failed show, and he'd lose everything. Show them the numbers from the pre-orders, he replied, returning to his work. Show them how many women are waiting for someone to design clothes that don't apologize for existing. The wall behind him was covered in inspiration photographs of women who'd broken barriers, shattered expectations. Scientists, athletes, politicians, artists. Their faces watched over his work, reminding him why every stitch mattered. Sarah appeared from the cutting room, her face drawn with exhaustion. The silk for the finale piece is delayed. Supplier says they won't release it without full payment up front. Another obstacle. Another test of his resolve. Adrian reached for his phone, ready to call in his last favor, when Isabella burst through the door. Put that phone down, she commanded, dropping a roll of midnight blue silk on his table. This is better than what you ordered anyway. Consider it an investment in the future of fashion. Adrian touched the silk reverently, its quality obvious even in the dim light. Isabella, I can't. You can and you will. She cut him off with a wave. I didn't fight my way through this industry's prejudices just to watch another visionary be crushed by small-minded people with big wallets. The silk would become his finale piece, a gown that defied categorization, blending strength with sensuality, structure with fluidity. Every piece in the collection carried this duality, challenging the very notion that fashion had to choose between power and beauty. Days blurred into nights as the collection took shape. Adrian's team worked with fierce dedication, each person understanding that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Elena visited often, bringing food that usually went cold before anyone remembered to eat it. Mom would kill me if she knew I was enabling your workaholism, she said one night, watching him hand-stitch a particularly complex bodice. but she'd be proud of what you're creating here. The mention of their mother hit hard. She passed away 2 years ago, before seeing his first major show. Her last words to him had been, "Show them what beauty really means, my love." The pressure mounted as show day approached. Fashion blogs speculated wildly about the collection, some predicting his triumphant redemption, others gleefully anticipating his downfall. Victoria's latest article had been particularly vicious. Sources suggest Chen's upcoming collection is a desperate attempt to prove his relevance in a conversation that has moved beyond him. One must question the wisdom of such emotional investment in what should be a rational business decision. But Adrian had stopped reading the critics. His focus was absolute, his vision clearer than ever. Each piece in the collection spoke to a different aspect of feminine power, not as he imagined it, but as he'd observed it, learned it, respected it through years of listening to the women in his life. "The hemline isn't working," he muttered one night, 3 days before the show. The atelier was empty except for Marcus, who'd long since given up trying to enforce normal working hours. "The hemline is perfect," Marcus countered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You're seeing problems that don't exist because you haven't slept in 2 days." Adrian stepped back, running his hands through his disheveled hair. The mirror showed him a stranger, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, clothing wrinkled from too many hours bent over his work. But his eyes burned with an intensity that transformed his exhaustion into something almost ethereal. "This isn't just about clothes anymore," he said softly. "It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every artist who's been judged not by their work but by who they are." A noise from the doorway made them both turn. Diane Winters stood there, her presence as commanding as ever. The retail queen who'd sworn never to stock his designs had somehow found her way into his atelier at midnight. "I heard you were killing yourself over this collection," she said, moving into the room with practiced grace. "I had to see for myself." Adrian straightened, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. "Ms. Winters, Show me," she interrupted, gesturing to the racks of completed pieces. "Show me what's worth all this sacrifice." For the next hour, Adrian walked her through the collection. His exhaustion fell away as he explained each piece, each decision, each subtle revolution hidden in seams and silhouettes. Diane listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to him. "You know what they're saying about you in the industry? That I'm a man who doesn't know his place?" Adrian's smile was tired but genuine. "That you're dangerous," she corrected. "Not because you're a man designing for women, but because you're making everyone question their assumptions about what that means." She moved to the finale piece, her hand hovering over the silk. "This collection, it's not about proving you belong in women's fashion. It's about proving that fashion doesn't belong to anyone. That true artistry transcends gender." Adrian felt tears pricking at his eyes, but blamed it on exhaustion. "Try telling that to Victoria Blackwood." "Victoria," Diane said with a hint of disdain, "is fighting yesterday's battles. You're creating tomorrow's victory." She turned to leave, then paused. "Clear space in your schedule for a buying meeting next week. Bergdorf's might be ready to reconsider its position." After she left, the atelier seemed somehow different. The air itself felt charged with possibility. "Did that just happen?" Marcus asked, wide-eyed. Adrian was already back at his workstation, energized despite his exhaustion. "It happened. Now we have to make sure we deserve it." The next 3 days passed in a blur of final adjustments and sleepless nights. Every detail had to be perfect, every stitch had to tell its part of the story. Adrian's team worked with the focus of soldiers preparing for battle, understanding that this collection was their line in the sand. The night before the show, Adrian stood alone in his atelier, surrounded by his creation. Each piece hung ready, waiting to make its statement on the runway. His fingers traced the familiar fabrics, remembering every moment of their creation, the doubts, the fears, the triumphs. Elena's voice came from the doorway. "Time to go home, big brother. Tomorrow's a big day." Adrian nodded but didn't move. "Do you remember what Mom used to say about fashion?" "That clothes are just armor made of dreams," Elena replied softly, moving to stand beside him. "And everyone deserves armor that makes them feel invincible." Tomorrow, Adrian would send his dreams down the runway. Tomorrow, he would show Victoria, the industry, and the world that great design knows no gender. But tonight, in the quiet of his atelier, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his vision, he allowed himself a moment to simply be proud of what he'd created. Not because it would prove his critics wrong, but because it proved his mother right. Beauty really does transcend all boundaries, if you're brave enough to let it. The Thompson Center hummed with electric anticipation as the last rays of sunset painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold. Backstage, Adrian moved through the organized chaos with practiced calm, though his heart thundered against his ribs. Each model was a living canvas, wearing pieces that represented not just fashion, but revolution. 5 minutes to first walk, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the tension. Victoria Blackwood is in her seat. Front row, center, just as requested. Adrian nodded, making a final adjustment to the opening look, a suit that redefined power dressing, its lines both commanding and graceful. The model wearing it, Zara, caught his eye in the mirror. Ready to make history, boss? Ready to show them what fashion really means, he replied, his voice soft but determined. The ambient chatter from the other side of the curtain grew as the fashion elite found their seats. Diane Winters had arrived with her entire buying team. Isabel was there, alongside editors from every major fashion publication. The stakes couldn't be higher. Marcus appeared at his side, tablet in hand. Social media is already buzzing. Number 10 collection is trending. They're calling it either the comeback of the decade or the final nail in your coffin. Then let's give them something worth talking about. Adrian gathered his team for one final moment. Remember, every piece tells a story. Every walk is a statement. We're not just showing clothes today, we're showing them what happens when art transcends prejudice. The lights dimmed, and the familiar hush fell over the audience. Adrian's recorded voice filled the space. Fashion isn't about gender. It's about transformation. About becoming who you were always meant to be. The first beats of the music pulsed through the speakers, a haunting remix of a classical piece, both familiar and revolutionary. Just like his collection. Zara stepped onto the runway, the suit moving like liquid midnight around her frame. The audience's collective intake of breath was audible even backstage. Adrian watched on the monitor as she commanded the runway, every step deliberate, every angle perfect. Victoria's face appeared in close-up on the screen, her expression carefully neutral, but her white-knuckle grip on her notebook betrayed her tension. Look after look, Adrian's vision unfolded before the industry's critical eyes. A dress that seemed to defy gravity, its structure both protective and revealing. A coat that transformed as the model walked, its layers telling a story of metamorphosis. Each piece was a carefully crafted response to every criticism, every doubt, every dismissal he'd endured. Halfway through the show, the energy in the room shifted. Phone cameras raised in unison as a plus-size model wore a gown that celebrated every curve while maintaining impeccable tailoring. Adrian had fought to include diverse models, refusing to let his vision be confined to traditional fashion boundaries. They're loving it, Marcus whispered, showing him the live reactions flooding social media. Even the critics are running out of criticism. But Adrian's focus was on the monitor, watching Victoria's face as each look challenged her preconceptions. Her pen moved constantly, but her usual smirk had been replaced by something closer to confusion, maybe even wonder. The tempo of the music changed as they approached the finale. Adrian's hands shook slightly as he held the last model into his masterpiece. The midnight blue silk transformed into something otherworldly. The gown was his answer to every question about his right to create, every doubt about his understanding of the female form. It's time, Sarah said softly. The model stepped onto the runway, and the room fell silent. The gown moved like water, like shadows, like dreams made tangible. Its structure celebrated strength while embracing softness, its details telling a story of breaking free from expectations. Adrian watched Victoria on the monitor. Her pen had stopped moving. Her usual mask of criticism had cracked, revealing something raw and genuine beneath. She reached up, quickly wiping away what might have been a tear. The finale walk began, all 40 pieces returning to the runway in a carefully choreographed celebration of diversity and design. The audience rose in a standing ovation before the last model had even finished her walk. The sound was deafening, electric, transformative. Adrian stepped onto the runway for his bow, and the roar intensified. In the front row, Diane Winters was nodding appreciatively. Isabella was beaming with pride. And Victoria Blackwood was standing with the rest, her face a complex mixture of emotions. Backstage was a blur of congratulations and chaos. Fashion editors pushed forward, demanding immediate interviews. Buyers waved their cards, trying to secure appointments. But Adrian's attention was caught by a figure moving against the crowd. Victoria stood before him, her usual confidence somewhat dimmed. She started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with her words. I came here tonight expecting to write your professional obituary. And now? Adrian asked quietly. Now I have to admit that I was wrong. The words seemed to cost her, but she continued. Not just about tonight, but about everything. I let my prejudices blind me to true artistry. This collection, it's not just clothes. It's a conversation about what fashion can be when we stop limiting who can create it. Before Adrian could respond, Diane Winters appeared. Darling, that was magnificent. Bergdorf's wants exclusive rights to the entire collection. And I mean the entire collection. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of negotiations, congratulations, and celebrations. The industry's most powerful players clamored for his attention, but Adrian's mind kept returning to Victoria's words. Not because he needed her validation, but because her admission represented something larger, the beginning of real change. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the cleanup crews had begun their work, Adrian stood alone on the empty runway. The space still hummed with lingering energy, with dreams realized and barriers broken. Marcus found him there, champagne bottle in hand. The reviews are already coming in. They're calling it a watershed moment in fashion history. Victoria's live blog post is trending. The future of fashion has no gender. How Adrian Chen proved me wrong. Adrian smiled, taking the bottle. It was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving that fashion is bigger than our prejudices, more powerful than our preconceptions. And you did that. Isabella's voice came from behind them. She joined them on the runway, her eyes bright with pride and champagne. You didn't just show them beautiful clothes, you showed them what courage looks like when it's worn as elegantly as any garment. The three of them stood there, sharing the bottle and the moment. Through the windows, Manhattan's lights sparkled like sequins on midnight fabric. Adrian thought about his journey from the little boy, sketching dresses in secret, to the designer who had just changed the conversation about gender and fashion. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Mom would be so proud. You didn't just show them what beauty means, you showed them what it means to be fearlessly, unapologetically yourself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities to push boundaries and transform perspectives. But tonight, standing on the runway where his dreams had finally taken flight, Adrian Chen knew that he had done more than create a successful collection. He had shown the world that true artistry knows no gender, that creativity cannot be confined by prejudice, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let others define your right to create beauty. The fashion world would never be the same, and neither would he. The September issue of Style and Substance landed on Adrian's desk with a satisfying thud. 6 months had passed since his revolutionary show, and the magazine's cover featured his midnight blue finale gown, now iconic in the fashion world. But it wasn't the image that caught his attention, it was Victoria Blackwood's headline, "The Gender Revolution in Fashion. How Wrong We've Been." "Have you read it yet?" Marcus asked, perching on the edge of Adrian's desk in their newly expanded atelier. The space hummed with activity, twice the size of their original studio, and filled with a growing team of diverse creators. Adrian ran his fingers over the glossy cover. "I'm savoring the moment." Inside, Victoria's words were a masterclass in accountability. "Fashion has long operated under the illusion that creativity is somehow tied to gender," she wrote. "In clinging to this prejudice, we nearly silenced one of the most important voices in modern design." Adrian Chen didn't just prove his critics wrong, he forced us to confront our own biases about who has the right to create beauty. The article was already sending shockwaves through the industry. 3 major design schools had announced revisions to their admissions policies, explicitly welcoming designers regardless of gender. The Designers Guild had launched a mentorship program specifically for underrepresented creators. Diane's online one, Sarah, called out, her role expanded from production manager to chief operations officer. The holiday collection numbers are in. The numbers were staggering. Since his breakthrough show, Adrian's designs have become more than fashion, they were statements of identity and empowerment. Every piece sold told a story of transformation, not just for the wearer, but for the industry itself. Isabella swept into the studio, her energy filling the space. "Have you seen the applications for the fellowship?" After the show, she and Adrian had established the Future of Fashion Fellowship, supporting emerging designers who challenged industry norms. 200 applications in the first week, Adrian confirmed, smiling. From designers of every gender, background, and perspective. The fellowship was just one part of the change rippling through fashion. Major brands were reassessing their creative teams, focusing on talent rather than traditional expectations. Fashion weeks worldwide were showcasing more diverse voices than ever before. "Your mother would be proud," Elena said softly, entering with a garment bag. Inside was the first piece Adrian had ever designed, a simple dress he'd made for her graduation, carefully preserved through the years. She always said you'd change the world. She just didn't know you'd change it so beautifully. The dress would be the centerpiece of the Metropolitan Museum's upcoming exhibition, Breaking Boundaries, Gender and Innovation in Fashion. Adrian's collection had earned him more than commercial success, it had secured his place in fashion history. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. Meeting at the usual place? We need to discuss your contribution to next month's feature on emerging designers. Their weekly meetings had become something of an industry legend. Former adversaries turned unlikely allies, working together to reshape fashion's future. Over coffee and sketches, they had found common ground in their dedication to nurturing new talent. The waiting list for the spring collection is already at 3,000, Marcus announced, scrolling through his tablet. And the documentary crew wants to know if you're ready to see the rough cut. The documentary Threads of Change. The Adrian Chen story was set to premiere at Sundance. But for Adrian, the real story wasn't about him. It was about every designer who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every creative voice silenced by prejudice. Did you see this? Sarah held up her phone, showing him the latest industry news. Another major fashion house had appointed a male creative director for their womenswear division. The announcement mentioned Adrian by name, crediting him with opening doors that had been shut by tradition rather than talent. Adrian moved through his studio, touching fabrics, watching his team work. Each person represented a different perspective, a different journey. He made sure of that when expanding his team, understanding that true innovation comes from diversity of experience. Victoria arrived for their meeting, her entrance no longer causing the tense silence it once had. She carried a portfolio of emerging designers' work, her commitment to nurturing new talent as fierce as her former criticism had been. "Ready to help me spot the next revolution?" she asked, settling into what had become her usual chair. "The revolution's already happening," Adrian replied, gesturing to his bustling studio. "We were just making sure everyone gets to be part of it." They spent the afternoon reviewing portfolios, their conversation flowing easily between critique and celebration. Victoria had become one of his strongest advocates, her influence helping to dismantle the very barriers she had once defended. As evening approached, Adrian found himself alone in his office, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. On his desk sat the latest industry awards recognition that once seemed impossible. But more meaningful were the letters that arrived daily from young designers who saw in his journey the permission to pursue their own dreams. Elena appeared in the doorway. "Ready for dinner?" Mom's recipe. Their weekly family dinners had become sacred, a reminder of what really mattered amid the whirlwind of success. Tonight, they would be joined by Isabella, Marcus, and yes, even Victoria, the family he'd found in fashion's revolution. "You know what Mom used to say about dinner?" Elena asked as they gathered their things. "That sharing food is like sharing dreams," Adrian finished, smiling. "Everyone brings something to the table, and everyone leaves richer for it." As they left the studio, Adrian paused to look at the wall of photographs, his journey from outsider to pioneer captured in images. But his favorite wasn't of any runway or award ceremony. It was a simple snapshot of his first sewing machine, the one his mother had bought him despite his father's objections. The fashion world had changed, and he had been part of that change. But the real triumph wasn't in proving critics wrong or winning awards. It was in creating a space where talent could flourish regardless of gender, where creativity knew no boundaries, and where the next generation of designers could dream without limits. "Coming?" Elena called from the elevator. Adrian nodded, turning away from the photographs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to push boundaries and transform perspectives. But tonight was for celebration not just of how far they'd come, but of all the journeys yet to begin. As they stepped into the New York night, Adrian thought about all the young designers who would follow, each adding their voice to fashion's evolving story. He had done more than survive the industry's prejudices, he had helped transform them into stepping stones for future generations. The revolution wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, finally, everyone was invited to the runway.